Okay, so it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Catherine Bradshaw from the Met Office. So Catherine works for the Met Office, but she also has a part-time role at the University of Exeter, and she's going to outline the work that she and colleagues in the Met Office have been doing to understand how climate change is altering pest risks. And I think it's pretty pertinent at the moment because we've had a deluge for several weeks, and it looks from the weather forecasters if now we're going to have some quite high temperatures relatively in the middle of this week. So it's quite easy to believe that climate change is actually happening. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, it's looking good to me.
Right, just need to move the camera that way. Okay, so you're seeing everything.
Seeing your,
okay.
Yeah, slideshow. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to try and cover quite a lot of information in this talk, and I might go quite quickly at times because I want to give you a big overview of the sorts of things that we do at the Met Office. Some of it will be a quick overview, and some of it will be a deeper dive into certain aspects of the work. If I go over something too quickly that you're interested in, I'm happy to send more information later by email, or if we've got time for questions at the end. So just going to start with a very brief introduction to the Met Office, just in case anybody doesn't know who we are. We are the UK's National Meteorological Service, and we're also the UK government's principal centre for climate research. And as an organisation, we have a broad remit to provide services to government, the public and industry. We operate 24/7 and employ more than 2,000 people across 60 locations, though most of those are employed where I'm sat now in Exeter in Devon. We work across the UK and internationally through targeted partnerships, and we provide weather forecasts, as I'm sure you're aware, and severe weather warnings. But we also maintain national observing networks, supply climate monitoring, climate services, advice to government and industry to support a wide variety of sectors, military, civilian, emergency planning, resilience planning, and we contribute data and expertise also to the World Meteorological Organization. So trying to understand and mimic and predict the Earth system is at the core of how we achieve all these goals. And we do this by incorporating, first of all, observations from the global observing network into a computer model. And then we run the model forwards, and sometimes we run it backwards to predict how the state of the atmosphere and the ocean will change with time. Our climate model, weather model, climate model, I'll come on to that in a second. Computer model splits the world up into little cubes, as is demonstrated in this plot here. And the predictions are made by solving mathematical equations of physics, chemistry, and biology to pass fluxes through the cubes to each other. So unlike many climate modelling centres in other countries, the Met Office use a single unified computer model to simulate both the weather and the climate on different timescales. And this allows us to make seamless predictions, and advances that we make in our understanding of weather then get translated through to climate simulations that we do, and any advances we make in terms of climate get translated through to our weather forecasts. So from the pest and disease perspective, we use information from our models on weather timescales within other models to help inform decisions about potential incursions and spread of pests and diseases. And we do this operationally as well as for research purposes. So I've just introduced our climate model, but there's another very important kind of model that we use called an atmospheric dispersion model, and this is called NAME, which makes it a little bit hard to search for. Atmospheric dispersion modelling is used in many different sectors across the Met Office. Look at things like dust, smoke, pollution, radiological material, and also these biological applications such as the pollen forecast, fungal spore dispersal, foot and mouth, blue tongue virus, so insects in here as well. So we monitor the dispersal of midges that carry the blue tongue virus, and we have also some initial instances of looking at locusts and aphids. I have a PhD student at the moment looking at aphids. So the NAME model is different because it simulates how particles are affected by the weather as they move through the atmosphere, rather than modelling the weather in a cube in the grid as I showed before. So this model is is driven by the outputs of our weather forecast model. If I just move forward a few slides, you'll see how the particles move. So you release particles from a point and they get dispersed through the atmosphere. So what you can see in the colours here, the height in the atmosphere for these different particles, and the black at the bottom is showing where those particles have been deposited on the ground. So there are lots of different processes in this atmospheric dispersion model that aren't in our climate model that act on these particles, things like settling out due to gravity and processes that happen within clouds and being rained out by rainfall. So an example of using this is our fungal spore dispersal system. And in particular, I'm going to talk about an example with stem rust. So for these stem rust fungal spores, our NAME model simulates weather-dependent release. So it will only release the spores when the weather is at certain conditions. It will disperse them through the atmosphere, deposit them on the ground, as I said, through wet and dry processes. And it will also simulate how spore viability is affected by UV radiation as they're being transported. So this kind of model is used operationally as part of the disease and early warning system, which provides forecasts of the predicted stem rust, fungal spore deposition over areas of susceptible crops. So here I'm showing an example plot for Ethiopia in 2023. So this is showing where and how many spores have been deposited on the ground. This can be combined with models of environmental suitability. So this is to answer the question, okay, if the spores are there, what's the likelihood that they will germinate and cause a new infection? So this kind of modelling is done with our partners at the University of Cambridge. And you can combine this information together to make an area risk assessment, which also takes into account the growth stage of the crop, and it allows identification of the areas where targeted controls might be needed. This system is currently operational in parts of Africa, Asia and South America, and it covers not only stem rust, as I've talked about here, but also other rusts and wheat blast. So one of the benefits of having a model is that we can also use it to test what-if scenarios. And an example of this is, again, the stem rust work, but a particular variant called UG99, which was particularly virulent and is essentially bringing stem rust back as a disease of concern globally to the UK, as well as in those countries I mentioned before. So it was first identified in Uganda and it spread to the Middle East, and there was a need to know where it might go next. And this particular project was looking at potential transmission pathways from the Middle East over to Eastern Asia. So it's a hypothetical project because UG99 was recorded in the Middle East in 2007 and 2019, but here in this little animation I'm showing what could have happened if there had been an outbreak in 2017 and how the outbreak would spread across from the Middle East. So the orange plume is showing where the spores are depositing on the ground. I realised that there's a mismatch between my key and the plot here. So the blue/yellow circles are sites that have been infected, and the red squares are showing when that site that's been infected then becomes a potential new source of spores that can then go on and infect elsewhere. So an enhancement that we made to this project was to also include the alternate host for stem rust, barberry, into the life cycle. And this is needed because wheat is not the only host plant for stem rust. And in order to complete its life cycle, a transition to barberry is actually required. So there's different transitions to different spore types that stem rust makes in its life cycle. Wheat is only infected by one of them, these Uridineo spores. Close to harvest, the spore production changes to a different type of spore called teleospores. They can survive on wheat stubble and volunteer grasses and other wild grasses throughout the winter. And then they change to another type of spore in the winter called basidiospores when they germinate in the spring. So without the presence of this alternate host barberry, that's the final stage of their life cycle. So to incorporate barberry into the life cycle, we need to add 2 new crop types. We add wheat stubble/grass, and we add barberry itself. This then becomes a lot more complicated. There's now 3 columns in my little disease spread animation, 3 types of crop, and the infection is spreading between each of them at each site. So I've just stopped here to show that the transition has been made from wheat to wheat stubble and grass at this point. So there's no barberry infected here. So we can use this information to look at if there was an outbreak, where is it likely to go? And then if you run many simulations, you can work out the probability of different pathways becoming viable. That's a brief introduction to weather timescales. So now if we look at climate timescales, and this is the kind of timescale which will indicate the risk of establishment of a new pest or disease and the frequency of outbreaks. So the UK climate is projected to become warmer and drier in the summer and warmer and wetter in the winter as a broad picture. We can look at what the biological impacts of those sorts of changes might be. So hotter summers, we might expect more generations per year. Milder winters, we'll expect greater overwintering and larger pest populations if there are fewer frost days. Wetter winters mean greater fungal pathogen survival. Extreme rainfall will help disperse and germinate those pathogens. But as Rosemary mentioned right at the beginning, weather variability is also very important in terms of stressing the host and making them more vulnerable to pest and disease anyway. And then we might expect to see more boom-bust cycles and unexpected outbreaks. And we also might expect to see some temporary establishment of non-native pests. So to talk about a climate time scale example, I'm going to talk about the wheat dwarf virus and its vector, the leafhopper. So this is a serious economically important disease of cereal crops. It causes stunting, discoloration, reduced production, delayed maturity, and shriveled grains. And once infected, the plants don't recover, so plant death is also common. The disease is solely transmitted by this leafhopper. I'm not 100% sure how you say it. I'm going to call it Samotetics alienus, and that's the last time I'm going to say it. I'm going to call it leafhopper from now. So this is widespread across Europe and North America, and there are increasing concerns about the virus in the UK due to the detection and spread of its vector, and it's been added to the UK Plant Health Risk Register, and DEFRA have performed a pest risk analysis of this virus. So current evidence for the presence of the leafhopper in the UK is limited, but specific sightings have been made in the southeast. But recent surveillance suggests that weak dwarf virus itself is much more widespread than previously thought. So it's entirely possible that the leafhopper has been significantly misidentified. There are two strains of this disease, a wheat strain and a barley strain, but the leafhopper is able to carry them both at the same time. I'm showing here wheat production in the UK is widespread, but concentrated over on the east of the country, which is coincident with where these confirmed sightings of the leafhopper are. Barley and oats is also affected. These are more heavily concentrated in Scotland. And so I've used the combination of all these crop distributions to mask the regions of interest. Current controls are via an autumn application of insecticide to target overwintering leafhoppers, but reliance on insecticides as a control is likely to become increasingly problematic due to the regulatory restrictions and resistance concerns. Study of the life cycle of the leafhopper is, like a lot of pests, quite limited, but there are known to be 7 embryonic stages and 5 nymphal stages. Peak population density in Northern Europe is typically mid-August and mid-September, and there can be 2 generations per year, but 4 generations per year have been recorded in France. Climate change is expected to exacerbate these risks by lengthening the periods of vector activity and enabling wider distribution, when this is likely to then lead to potentially higher infection pressure. We worked with Rothamsted Research on this project as part of the Genetic Improvement Network to perform a risk assessment under current and future climate change. Climate threshold information comes from just 2 laboratory studies, so one done at 20 degrees and one done at 27 degrees. So the majority of the work looks at the 20-degree example. To just give a quick insight into some of the sorts of data pre-processing that we need to do before we can do such an assessment is to look at historical climate data. So here, this is 1 kilometre resolution data from 1931, a data set called Had UK Grid. And future climate data is taken from the UK CP18 regional climate projections. And this is under the high emissions scenario RCP 8.5 only. So this is like a worst case scenario assessment. Because of the difference in resolution, so the regional climate projections are at 12 kilometre resolution. So we first need to aggregate the 1 kilometre historical data up to 12 kilometres. And there are also 12 different ensemble members in the climate projections. So that means that we ran the simulations 12 times with slightly different initial conditions and maybe slightly different parameters in the model to get a better picture of the uncertainty. The last step of pre-processing is a bias correction. So climate models drift away from known observations, so we make a correction to that systematic bias. And in this case, we used a scaled distribution mapping technique. Okay, so now that we have that climate data, those laboratory thresholds, we can look at the changing patterns of suitability. So in these plots, I'm showing the decadal average for each panel. The first date suitable for egg dormancy, in this case, I'm taking as the first day between September and December every year, where the mean daily temperature falls below 10 degrees. So the base temperature was 10 degrees. So historically in England and Wales, this has been a date in October, and in Scotland, it's a month earlier in September. This decade here, 2000 to 2009, stands out as being perhaps a little bit milder and the most delayed onset of that egg dormancy potential. More striking, though, is the declining trend that we can see here in the number of days in autumn and winter that have conditions cold enough to make eggs dormant. And this is reducing by about 20 days per year in England and Wales and about 10 days per year in Scotland across this time series. So in the future scenario plots I'm showing here, I'm showing the 10th, 50th and 90th percentile situations across those 12 model ensemble members. And I show the situation for the 2030s in the top row and the 2050s in the bottom row. All of these results are an anomaly as compared to present. So unsurprisingly, we can see that the climate change trend is continuing out to the near term and long term. So the first suitable date is becoming more distant, and the total number of days of suitability for egg dormancy is reducing. Notably, the largest delay in the onset occurs in Scotland at 15 to 25 days later by the 2050s as compared to today. In contrast, there's been considerable decadal variability in the potential onset date for egg hatching. So this is now the first day between January and April, where the mean daily temperature first rises above 10 degrees. So we can see there's a bit of variability going on here. And this particular 30-year period was the most delayed in England and Wales. And this next 30-year period from 1990 to 2019 was actually quite similar to that first decade, 1931 to 1939. The duration of egg hatching, that's ranging from less than 5 days in Scotland to 30 to 40 days in England and Wales. And this decade here, 1970 to 79, has the lowest number of days suitable for egg hatching and also the least spatial gradient across the UK. In the future, climate projections suggest that the onset date is becoming more distant again, more closer, by 10 days per year in the 2030s and 20 days in the 2050s. And interestingly, the greatest reductions now are in the Midlands. So in the future, the duration of springtime egg hatching potential increases by up to 5 days in the 2030s and up to 15 days in the 2050s. And Scotland experienced the least change and the South Coast the most. So you can see it's quite variable depending on which time of year we're talking about and what the metric we're looking at is. So the onset date for adult cold-related mortality. So this is now the temperature between September and December, where the minimum daily temperature first falls below -5, and this is the temperature at which the adults will be killed off, is very variable from decade to decade and was also not met in many locations in certain times. In particular, this decade, 2010 to 2019, stands out as being particularly mild in the winter. The duration of days capable of killing these leafhoppers, with the exception of this particularly cold decade, 1960 to 69, the threshold is only met prior to the 31st of December on a couple of occasions every year. So this is a rare occurrence. In the future, this is the first metric where we see a bit of a mixed response to climate change. In some parts of the country, it's increasing by 10 to 15 days, and some parts of the country, it's decreasing by 5 to 10 days. And as we go out to the 2050s, that mixed signal is widening in this metric. However, the duration of days that are below that threshold or meeting that threshold is reducing towards 0 in any case in all regions. So to bring this together, we'd look to then look at completion of multiple generations, and degree day analysis shows that since the 1970s, an increasing area of England and Wales has been capable of completing a single generation of the leafhopper, and the earliest completion date, assuming initiation of egg laying in March, is the end of July. So although that grid cell analysis doesn't show capability for completion of a second generation in the current climate, This is because I was only colouring in a grid cell if a second generation was completed for at least half of the decade, so 5 out of the 10 years. And that didn't happen in any of the grid cells. But it does happen for individual years if we look at the county level. So I'm showing some counties across East Anglia here. And there's evidence that the second generation could have been completed in Essex since the 1950s, and in other East Anglian counties, apart from East Riding of Yorkshire, since the early 2000s. So future climate projections, we have an advance in the date that the first generation can be completed of late June for the 2030s, late May for the 2050s. So this is an advance of 20 to 30 days as compared to present. And this happens across all of our crop growing regions. Note now that where I was showing the anomaly to present, I'm now showing the absolute values here in these future projections. The warmer climate is also affording the opportunity for completing a second generation across much of England and Wales. And this is able to be completed by the end of August by the 2030s and by the end of July by the 2050s. So this is the same time as the first generation is in the current climate. At the county level, if we look at time series data, we can now see this strong trend of just over half a day per year, fewer days for the completion of that first generation. And in addition to the overall advancing trend, there's also a reduction in the uncertainty between the different models. So these bars are getting smaller. I'm just showing 3 counties here so that you can actually see the plots. The time series data also confirm the ability to complete a second generation by the 2030s. All of the counties examined here are showing the same pattern. At first, a few model ensemble members show the capability, but most don't. And there's a period of wide variability from year to year in the number of ensemble members that complete that second generation. And then we have a threshold state met, and all ensemble members complete a second generation with low variability from year to year. And then a declining trend is developing with that. Finally, the time series data are showing that all except East Riding of Yorkshire capable of completing a third generation by the 2050s. And even in East Riding, we can see some third generations starting to be completed by the 2070s. So just to summarise this little section, the results consistently demonstrate that UK climate is historically and under projected future climate conditions increasingly favourable for the life cycle completion and multiple generation completion of the leafhopper. And this therefore suggests a growing climate suitability potential for wheat dwarf virus incidents. Okay, so moving on to another quick example. This is the oak processionary moth. So this is a thermophilic pest whose range, abundance and impact are tightly linked to temperature and moisture patterns. Climate change, again, is going to play a significant role in increasing its spread across Europe, including parts of the UK. So overwinters on oak twigs, caterpillars emerge in the spring and feed and develop into moths by midsummer. These caterpillars defoliate oak trees, weakening them and making them more vulnerable to disease and environmental stress. And a major concern with this is their toxic hairs, which cause skin rashes, eye irritation, respiratory problems. And these hairs become airborne, and so they can pose health risks even after the caterpillars have gone. So originally limited to warmer parts of Europe, it's expanded northward in recent decades, and it was accidentally introduced into the UK through importing some trees in 2005, and it's now established in London and surrounds, as you can see on this map. Now, unfortunately, this is not our study. This is a study by somebody else, Freud et al. 2020, but they suggested that the climate was already suitable for the oak processionary moth in the UK at the time it was accidentally introduced. but they also suggest that the future climate changes are likely to allow this pest to progress northwards and westwards because of those milder winters and reduced number of frost days in particular. So weather stations, so that global observing system that I talked about at the beginning, the weather stations, they're not located where these pests live. Pests live in little microclimates and take advantage of those microclimates, so they're not the same thing. So colleagues of mine addressed this discrepancy at the Met Office through the development and application of a microclimate model, and this is with collaboration from DEFRA, Exeter University Forest Research and Kew Gardens. The microclimate model is able to downscale weather and climate data to take account of the conditions that the pest lives in. And for the oak processionary moth, you can see the difference that is made here for a test date in 2017. So this would be the date that they first start flying. Peak flight, sorry, not first date, peak flight date. And it can be 10 to 20 days different. So these improvements will help control the efforts, help the control efforts for this pest. And this has been one of the pests that's been incorporated into a climate pest risk web tool. And again, this is some colleagues of mine that have developed this in collaboration with DEFRA, FERA, Science, and the universities of Exeter and Warwick. And it can be used to examine aspects of the pest life cycle similar to those that I've just shown you, including timing of adult emergence or the expected number of generations per year, or as I was showing here, that estimated peak flight date for oak processionary moths. And I believe that this now incorporates those microclimate modelling advances. The tool is available here at this URL shown at in the green bar at the bottom, and it's got 10 priority pests in it, and they have different aspects of their life cycle that are simulated from degree day models, but you can also input your own parameters for the base temperature and growing degree thresholds if you want to create your own maps for some other pest. Okay, so moving out on to another case study. This is the cabbage stem flea beetle. I said before, when you have a model, you can do nice things with it, such as test different scenarios to ask what-if questions. And this is a potted look at a model to identify potential integrated pest management options for this cabbage stem flea beetle pest of oilseed rape. And this is work that I did under secondment to DEFRA's chemicals, pesticides and industrial waste team. So it's become more problematic in recent years because their primary pesticide, neonicotinoids, were banned in the European Union in 2013, and widespread resistance to the only other available pesticide alternative has been materializing. And so as a result of these infestations, production of oilseed rape has actually markedly declined since 2013. There's been, therefore, a lot of focus on IPM strategies that could perhaps help. These include things like companion cropping, altering the sowing date, altering the seed rate, management of the canopy, biological controls, cultivating the land after harvest. Some of these are not all going to be positive. Some of them are likely to have pros and cons, and we don't know how they might interact with each other. So came up with a population dynamics model. I'll break this down a little bit to make it less scary looking. So there's a life cycle model, sub-model I'm calling it, which is basically doing the same sort of thing as I've shown you before. It's using the temperature threshold data from the literature, from laboratory experiments, with the climate data to model the life cycle. There's an IPM strategy submodel that reduces the number of adults according to thresholds taken again from the literature. And there's an egg predator submodel. So this reduces the number of eggs, again, by factors taken from the literature. And this factor is also impacted by the IPM strategy and the presence of ground frost. So I've included just one predator in this submodel, and this is the carabid beetle species Trechus quadristriatus. Information on this carabid's feeding habits is quite limited, so I will, hands up, say assumptions are poorly constrained, and in some cases that's based on predation by other pests. It's assuming that the predator is active from the start date of egg laying until the date of that first frost. So although the evidence for other pests is that the predation rate itself might be sensitive to temperature, I've just used this flat reduction rate in this model. Other assumptions made are that the presence of a trap or companion crop is beneficial for those predators, and therefore the egg reduction rate is increased if they're included. And it's assumed that cultivation of the soil is detrimental for egg predators, and the egg reduction rate is reduced if those are included. So going back to the full schematic now, you can hopefully see a little bit more about how these submodels are linked and information is passed between them. The effect of climatic conditions on the growth of the crop itself or the life cycle of the egg predator aren't included. There's always ways you can improve models. So this model effectively finishes at the hatching stage and the estimate of the number of hatched larvae. So I'll quickly go through some results here. This is the control case for the present climate with no egg predators and no IPM strategies. And I'm starting here with a sowing date of oilseed rape in September. So you can see that there's more, quite a number of larvae, around 5,000 in the north and 10,000 in the south in the current climate after an initial number of 100 adults. So this is now the future climate. So this is roughly the 2050s that are being shown in the middle. And there's a 50 to 100% increase in the number of larvae as a result of that climate change. But there's also an increase in the standard deviation in the future period. And that means that the number of larvae we might expect every year will become more variable. Putting the egg predators into the model reduces the number of larvae in the present day as compared to that control, and also in the future, as we might expect. But what we actually see is that the impact of egg predators is also reducing the larvae in the future more, and this is because of the impact of those reduction of frost days, in which it allows the egg predators to remain active for longer, basically, so they can eat more eggs, and the impact of having them is therefore greater in the future than in the present. So what about the impact of control options? The first management strategy tested was neonicotinoids themselves. Hopefully, without showing you any comparison to the control, it's immediately obvious what the impact of banning that pesticide is on the population, both in the present climate and the future. Another strategy, as I said, was changing the drilling date, and I've got a couple of tests here with a start date of August and a start date of October. So September was the control. So you can see that in agreement with field trials, the earlier start date leads to more larvae and the later start date leads to less. And this is also true for the future. But what we can see is that the later start date also results in a number of larvae in the future scenario for October that's comparable to the number that we see in the present day for September. So that looks like it might be a good option. Other management strategies, as I said, were trap cropping, companion cropping, soil cultivation, and all of those are quite effective at reducing the number of larvae as compared to the control. In the present day and in the future. So they're both below present day. So if we now look at the time series, we can see the blue line here is showing the case where there are no pesticides and no IPM strategies. The pink line at the bottom is showing the neonicotinoid impact. The other lines are showing those IPM strategies that were tested. So it's clearly showing that none of the IPM strategies are able to reduce cabbage stem flea beetle level numbers to the level that neonicotinoids can, but they're all quite effective at reducing it as compared to doing nothing. We then delay that sowing date. We can see that dramatic impact that is happening. So it's delaying by 1 month, has almost halved the population as compared to that September control case. And furthermore, delaying the sowing date combined with these IPM strategies has resulted in a comparable population to the September case if we use the neonicotinoids. So if I just flip back, you can see these lines at the bottom around 200 are similar to the neonic population of 200. Now, if I show the impacts of climate change, by the 2050s, every aspect of that life cycle is negatively impacted by the temperature increases, and this is resulting in the populations doubling as compared to the present day. The scale on here has changed, and we now have levels from around 1,200 to more than 2,000 larvae. And this is suggesting that an increasing number of combined strategies is going to be needed to control this pest as the climate warms. Right, I shall try and speed up a little bit because I think it's getting close to the end of time. So large-scale climate drivers. So we looked at this part of the chart and we looked at this part of the chart. So now we're going to take a little look at this part in the middle here. And this is seasonal to decadal timescales, and this is the timescale at which preemptive actions could be taken. So again, as Rosemary said at the beginning, we've had a very wet period. The Met Office, along with other forecasting institutions, produce a seasonal forecast for between 2 and 6 months ahead. The wet winter, especially in the south, appears in this seasonal forecast that was produced last September, which says that the probability of a wet winter with above average rainfall was between 40 and 60%. So it's important to note when we're talking about seasonal or decadal timescales, we're talking about probabilistic forecasts. We're estimating whether conditions are going to be more or less likely than normal. We're not predicting what the weather will be for next season or next decade. So that's an important difference. The reason we can't do forecasting in the same way is because the atmosphere itself loses predictability after about 7 to 10 days. Monthly to decadal forecasting skill therefore comes from slower components of the climate system. So things like the land surface, and this is soil moisture content and snow cover, and this has skill of the order of a couple of weeks. And then we have the ocean and large-scale atmospheric dynamics. The large heat capacity of seawater means that the ocean keeps a longer memory of past atmospheric conditions and can affect the weather going forward on the order of months. So the global climate system exhibits many of these large-scale patterns of climate variability, and one you have probably heard of before is ENSO, or El Niño and La Niña years. And this is an oscillation in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, tropical Eastern Pacific Ocean, where sea surface temperatures oscillate from being between warmer than average to colder than average and back again. And it does this oscillation over a period of about 4 to 7 years, as you can see from the time series, the red and blue on the left. Now this ENSO oscillation pattern, there are certain well-known regional responses to El Niño and La Niña years in both temperature and rainfall, but every event is slightly different. So this is just a very broad generalization I'm showing you here. But in general, some regions get wetter, others get drier, some get warmer, some get cooler, all within the same El Niño year. So it's not the same response everywhere in the world. La Niña years tend to be the opposite, but there are some small differences. And maybe you can just about make out that there are no direct impacts of ENSO showing over the UK, and this means that ENSO is not a great predictor for UK seasonal forecasting. Fortunately, ENSO is just one of these large-scale modes of variability, and there's another one called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is very relevant for the UK. We have the winter NAO, where in its positive phase, we get warmer, wetter winters, and in its negative phase, we get colder, dry winters. And there's also a summer NAO, and in the summer, in its positive phase, we get warmer, drier summers, so that's different to the winter season. And in its negative phase, we get colder, wetter summers. But it's one thing understanding how the North Atlantic Oscillation works. It's quite another to predict which phase it might be in advance. And what we find is that our model has good skill at predicting the winter NAO in advance, but not so good at predicting the summer NAO. And this is because there are many other modes of climate variability. I'm listing just some of them here. And these affect UK weather on monthly to decadal timescales in varying degrees and on different timescales to each other. So some, I said, ENSO operates on a 4 to 7 years. Some of them oscillate over months. And it is, of course, a lot more complicated than I've just outlined because many of these modes interact with each other in ways that we're still learning about. So for this reason, there's been quite a little work done in the pest and disease space for seasonal forecasting, but potentially it could be very useful. So I think I'm rapidly running out of time. Yeah. One last example for you, peach potato aphid. One additional thing that our decadal forecasting system allows is the assessment of unprecedented events. And this is because the climate model simulations are run multiple times from the same starting point with slightly different initial conditions and parameters, like the ensemble that I talked about at the beginning. And this means we can look at uncertainty in our forecasts. And we can find examples where conditions are physically plausible but haven't been seen in the observational record before. So an example of this is Mysis persicae, the peach potato aphid, for which this kind of assessment here demonstrates that there's a 20 to 40 day earlier early flight in the decadal forecast than has been seen in the observations. So this is another potential area that's not been used a great deal for pests and diseases, but has great potential for looking at risks and climate drivers. So much of our complex scientific and technical work that we do relies on effective partnerships and collaborations. So I'd just like to say a quick thank you to all our collaborators here and a big apology if I've missed anybody off. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. Goodness me, you could do a talk on each of those topics. I think it's just, yeah, incredible, the scope. So have you got time to answer a few questions in the chat, Catherine? Are you okay?
Yep, I'm okay.
All right, so I'll go to the top of the chat. So I think you actually at least part answered the first question from Phil, which was about, is there any data on the survival and fecundity of beneficial organisms to offset the projected increases in pests and diseases that are of concern for crops? So wanting positive news. So you did touch on that, didn't you, later on?
Yeah, so we're actually scoping a new study at the moment with part of our partnership with DEFRA that is likely to, in fact, no, that's not quite right. Let me take that back. We are working in another project called CSSP China, which looks at, is going to look at biological controls and climate suitability for those. So watch this space.
Thank you. Sasha says, has the wheat virus modelling work been published?
The wheat dwarf virus work?
Virus, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is new, hot off the press. Hopefully it will be published soon, but yeah, it's hot off the press.
Brilliant.
So,
Then one from Maria. Is there a similar website to the UK Climate Pest Risk web tool, but for the rest of Europe?
I suspect there probably is, but I would need to get back to you about that because I don't know where it is or what it's called. But I think there is one that covers Europe. How similar it is, I'm not sure.
Mm.
Yes, I can
Great.
put that link in the chat.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and then there's a question about in the beginning you talked about models used in Africa, for example. Which countries and how can we get access to the data?
So the DWAS system is operating in countries in East Africa, I think, at the moment, although it's expanding it all the time. I think it covers Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia. It covers Nepal, Bangladesh. I think that will work. Just putting that in the chat. It's very small, but I think it works. That's the web tool link. The data. So yeah, if you would like to send me an email, I'll put my email in the chat. I can put you in touch with the people that you might need to speak to. Nope.
And I think you probably those of you, all of you, if you want information from the chat, you probably need to copy it now because I think you won't be able to access it the way we've set up the meeting. But I can always email the link, etc. around. The next question is, presumably you're working with pan-EU models too. Is there a bigger picture view of movement and impact of pests and diseases and collaborations with other EU nations too, both regarding potential increase in issues and solutions?
So the collaboration with the EU is more on the animal pests and pathogens rather than the plant ones at the moment. We have good relations with countries, particularly bordering the North Sea, so the Netherlands, Belgium, France, etc. And there are passage of information about outbreaks that are passed between the different places. We also combine our climate models with models from other countries. In terms of, I'm just trying to think whether there's any examples that come to my head. I don't think we have done very much for plants across Europe. That doesn't mean to say that we wouldn't like to. We're quite a small team in the Met Office and there's a lot of threats. Yeah, no, actually no. So fall armyworm, that's one that's been looked at for Europe, which I didn't have time to talk about today. But if you want to know more about fall armyworm, send me an email.
Excellent. And I think probably the last one. Do fungi and bacteria which infect pest species and kill them respond in kind to increases in ambient temperatures in a linear or non-linear way? I think this is a Dave Chandler question, actually.
They're likely to be a mix of both, depending on which aspect of their life cycle you're talking about. So when I was looking at cabbage stem flea beetle, for example, some of the responses were linear and some of them were not. So if they're not linear, I just put a curve fitting algorithm in to best mimic the data. But again, this is something that we might look into more in this new project that I talked about, CSSP China.
Fantastic. So I think that's probably, yeah, all. Brilliant. So thank you so much, Catherine. It
So,
really is amazing chunk of work that you're all doing, and so interesting. And yeah, and whoops, there's a new message coming in now. But yeah, and I think I've had some good messages from the audience as well. So yeah, thank you very much indeed. And we'll we'll save the recording and put it on the website as well, so you can listen to it again.
thank you.
Brilliant. And thank you to the audience. And the next webinar's on the 12th of March.